Hey y'all, today I want to record my first video for BookTube. It's supposed to be an introduction to who I am as a reader. This is like my introduction to quote unquote BookTube. So I wanted to do quick. I don't know if it's going to be quick. I have 8 books to talk about. So the way this video is going to go is I have 8 books that I've chosen from my personal collection of books that I have enjoyed reading a lot and have made an impact on me in some way or another. Um, I have chosen 4 nonfiction and 4 fiction books. I will start with fiction and then we will go to nonfiction. So we will start with. Wait, before I do that, I should introduce myself. Hi, I'm Sadik, aka Packet Cat. I read a lot. That is kind of my thing. I read a lot. You could call me Reading Cat instead, but Packet Cat is what I go by. So I like to read. I like to read fiction. I've been reading since I was a young child. I started reading fiction. I read nonfiction. I read encyclopedias. I read dictionaries. I read whatever I could get my hands on. So here I am, all these years later, making my first forays into video and into the world of booktube. I'd say, before we get into the books, I'd say what inspired me to do this, really, like what my inspiration is that I watch a few booktube creators on YouTube. Some of my favorites here, Lexi, aka Neely Nova, Carrie can read, uh, yeah, like those are the kind of uh, booktube creators that I sort of started watching, and I started becoming more and more interested in doing videos about books because I can talk about books for literally hours, and I have talked about books on phone calls and voice calls with friends for hours. So I decided, why not do my own video book review, whatever. So the format of this particular style of video is a more casual. I don't script these. I kind of make them. Uh, I kind of make them like off the cuff. Like these are unscripted, improvising. So we'll start with the books now. We got the first one. I'm gonna just hold the book up here for a second. This is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. I'll put links to all the Storygraph pages for all these books in the description, but I'll start by just doing a small description of this particular book. So this book, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, is a sci-fi novel by Becky Chambers, and Becky Chambers is a sci-fi author. And the reason I brought this book here today is I legitimately think Becky Chambers is quite possibly one of, if not one of the best sci-fi writers right now. I think her style of sci-fi is what I would call humane sci-fi. And the thing is, I don't like, actually, humane is a bad word because a lot of her books, like her style of writing, is very uh like like it's emotion focused. It's very emotional sci-fi, and it tackles a lot of different topics amongst the books. So this is like the first book in the Wayfarer series. So this is the first book, and when I first read this in 2022, it was funny because this book, I didn't know what to expect of it when I first started. Like I read the description, and the description is kind of unassuming. It's about a character named Rosemary Harper who joins a ship called the Wayfarer, and she isn't expecting much, and I'm not expecting much of this book when I first started. But this was interesting because the day I read this is one of the few books in my life that I read from start to finish in one day, in basically one sitting, in about a time span of about 5 hours. Uh, I had taken the day off from work because I was dealing with at the time was chronic insomnia, and I was extremely tired and sleep deprived. So I decided to take the day off from work and read instead. And I didn't expect to read the book the whole way through, but when I got through the whole book, I started reading, and I just couldn't stop. Like I think by the end of it, I was crying, I was laughing. Like this was got it all. Like all the whole emotional spectrum. I think Becky Chambers write characters so well. One of the things uh, about me when it comes to fiction is I'm very character focused, less that I'm plot focused, because I like to. One of the things I enjoy about fiction is interactions between characters, and I think Becky Chambers writes sci-fi characters in a way where they just feel so real, and even some of these characters are not human; they are aliens, and these I feel like these aliens are people that are understood, are connected with, even though their emotions, their patterns of behavior and patterns of thinking and philosophies are so different. They are aliens, but Becky makes aliens approachable in a way I've not really seen in sci-fi media since like Star Trek: The Next Generation or Star Trek: Deep Space Nine. I genuinely think Becky Chambers is legitimately one of the best writers, period. But legitimately, if you're into sci-fi, you would do well to check her out. And I recommend the entire series. I'm not going to talk about the entire series here, but rest assured, the rest of the series is just as good, and they are all very good books. So that is the first book that I'm going to tell. That's the first book. Let's talk about this is what is a more recent read. This is How You Lose a Time War by Amal El Mohtar and Max Gladstone. This is a rare one where it is a dual author. Uh, this is dual POV. Each point of view is written by a different author, and I was skeptical about this one because this one was highly rated by literally everybody. Like I would see discussions about this book literally in any book adjacent community I was in, and people would be like, "Oh my god, you need to read This Is How You Lose a Time War." And with books that are that popular, I'm always skeptical because I'm like, they get over. Sometimes books are like overrated, and I get to them and I get disappointed. But I gotta say, this book is some of the best romantic prose that I've read. It is prose. Like I think the way this book is written is very romantic. It's very poetic, and I genuinely think that it is legitimately some of the best I don't really read a lot of romance, and that's something I'm intending to correct going forward. But this book, if you're not a romance reader, and I suspect a lot of people who see this book and think it's like a romance novel, or rather, it gets categorized or reviewed as a romance novel. I think some people might be put off by it. If you don't read romance, you might be like, I don't think it's for me. But if you if you even like a little bit of romance in any kind of genre, I think you should read This Is How You Lose a Time War. I think it is not a long book. It's actually very short. It's about 200 or so pages. So you can get this. It's not a long one. I highly recommend this. If you see this at a bookstore or on your ebook reader or ebook store or audiobook, very good. And the next book is we're gonna dive into the world of fantasy for a bit. This is one of my favorite fantasies that I've read. Also, in actually the last book I should mention when I read this. I read this back in actually I read this earlier this year. I'm pretty sure, and I've been thinking about it ever since. Master of Jin by B. Jelly Clark. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that name right, so somebody correct me in the comments if I'm not saying it right. I'm sorry to Mr. Clark here. So this is a Master of Jinn. A Master of Jinn is a fantasy novel, like a historical fantasy novel set in steampunk Cairo in Egypt in 1912. And the main character, Fatma Al Sharawi, is like a young woman working for the Ministry of Alchemy, Enchantments, and Supernatural Entities. And the jinn, as they are, jinns are a brief introduction to the jinn. I'm not going to get into because jinns are a complicated bit of like there's a lot about jinns that I could get into, but it's not really not it's going to be a digression. But to suffice to say, jinns are creatures for Muslim mythology. They're one of God's creatures specifically. They're creatures that are also made by God. They're just made out of fire instead of how humans are made out of earth, of clay. So in this particular world, jinns live alongside humans, and that is one of the aspects of this book that I love. Like, it's so good to have these human characters, but also these jinn characters just be these weird ass motherfuckers just be hanging around. And one of the my favorite parts about this book is not only is it based on Muslim and Arab mythology, set in a city, in a setting that's not usually represented in. I mean, it's starting to get represented more in fantasy media, in fantasy books specifically, but the Middle East, specifically Egypt, and specifically, more specifically, Egypt shown through specifically an anti-colonialist, uh, colonialist vibe through line through this whole book, and it is like, I'm not gonna spoil it because I think everybody should read this one. But if you're a fantasy reader, especially if you want to read like a fantasy that's not like set using mythology in Western mythology of any kind, it's very much a book written with Muslim and Arab mythologies in mind, and it is a very good book. I highly recommend A Master of Jinn by P. Jali Clark. Exceedingly good. Um, the next book, this is going to be the last fiction book I want to talk about today. And this book is one of my favorite sci-fi novels of all time. I'll digress here for a bit and say that, like, I read mostly fantasy and sci-fi when I read fiction. I'm starting to branch out into more genres. I'm starting to read more nonfiction, as I'll talk about in a minute. But mainly, I read fiction, and sci-fi is one of my favorite genres. I'm a big Star Trek person. I love Star Trek. I've loved sci-fi since I was a child, and I watched the movie I, Robot for the first time. I'm fascinated with sci-fi as a genre, as a way of expressing like thought and emotion. So this book is what I would call like a space opera of the subgenre in sci-fi, where it's like grand things happening. So it's like an opera. So it's just like massive events happening, politics, intrigue. There's different worlds, different like planets and different systems, like political intrigue, like, personal and emotional intrigue. And this book is called A Memory Called Empire by R.K. Martin. And this book I read many years ago. I actually read this around the time it came out, which was, I think, in 2019 or 2020, I believe, and which was now 4 years ago. And I gotta say, like, as far as space operas go, this set a new bar for me as far as space opera sci-fi goes. I so far haven't found a book like A Memory Called Empire, and I've looked. Trust me, I've wanted a book like this. Nobody has even come close. Even R.K. Martin herself, with the uh, sequel to A Memory Called Empire, I think she, like, I felt like she like didn't really achieve the same level of quality that she did with Memory Call, but and that's an insult or meant to be a critique. Really, it's more that this book is so fucking good that it's hard to like compare. It's hard to for an author to do it twice. Like it's hard to capture lightning in a bottle twice. Sometimes as an author, you capture like a book, a thing in a bottle, and it's like lightning. Like, and this book is like lightning. And like Master of Jin, there are some similarities. Master of Jin is fantasy, it's a sci-fi, but this is also very much a book dealing with the topic of colonization and language and linguistics, and the ways language and linguistics affect colonization. How what different aspects. When people think of colonization, they often think of violent, brutal oppression, like people with guns and sticks in the streets beating, like the colonizer beating people up. But colonizing is way more subtle. It's more soft power than it is hard power. If you want to use like a political term, like a political science term, it is more soft power. Many of the times you're exerting power through language, through culture, through food, even. So, like, I think in many ways, this book and A Master of Jin are very similar that way. And the way this book tells the story of Ambassador Mahir, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce her last name because I'm going to fuck that one up. So Ambassador Mahir and is dealing with what is called a takes Calamity. I should have practiced that before I started recording, but as I said, this is unscripted, so we do this live. Takes Calamity Empire, and it's an imperial empire, obviously, as it's the empire, so obviously it's imperial. It's spans multiple systems, probably hundreds. I think it's like hundreds of thousands of systems, and it's a massive empire. And it's talking about Ambassador Mahid from this small backwater sort of system, and she goes to the core, the capital of the interstellar empire. And the interactions between her and her characters, her friends, her enemies, the protagonist, the antagonist, the way the political intrigue, the way the narrative of colonization is woven through the narrative is so well done. I think genuinely, like, if I had to give somebody a book about colonization and I didn't want to scare them off with something more serious and violent, I think A Memory Called Empire is a good place to start, especially if you enjoy sci-fi and you specifically enjoy space opera sci-fi. You haven't read this book, I don't know what you're doing. Like, you gotta read this one. So those are four. All four of these fiction titles are books that I have very much enjoyed for one reason or another, and have made a significant impact to me in some way or other. Like some for example, I think This Is How You Lose a Time War is a way for me to get into the fiction genre that is the romance genre in a way that I didn't expect to get into romance. And one of these days I'm going to start reading more romance, but I have a few books that I have yet to read that are sitting in my to be read pile, which is like 100 books long and always grows rather than get smaller. So, and The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet taught me, the thing it told me is that there are sci-fi authors right now, writing sci-fi that is more of the worlds I want to, like, better term for sci-fi I think I should use here is speculative fiction. And as a person who enjoys speculative fiction, I think the kind of worlds that Becky Chambers or even Arkady Martin that talked about builds in their books is more of the kind of speculative fiction I want to see in the world. So it definitely is. And A Master of Jin is it's just refreshing to see a book that's not set using, say, Christian imagery or Western ancient Greek or ancient Roman or any of those mythologies, and instead is using a mythology that's like slowly starting to pick up steam, but a mythology that's a very interesting, has a lot of variety, a lot of interesting characters, a lot of interesting stories, a lot of interesting myths and mythologies and characters. So it is, as a person with skin that's not white, uh, I like to enjoy fantasy that is not set in Western mythologies, and that book is one of those examples of exemplary work in that particular category. So I want to talk about nonfiction. And nonfiction is interesting because I've only really recently started reading nonfiction this year. Actually, I made an effort in particular to read more nonfiction because I've realized that I did not, uh, I did not really read a lot of nonfiction for a while because nonfiction is harder for me to read, and I enjoy reading fiction more. And usually, I read books for entertainment sometimes, for fun and enjoyment. And a lot of nonfiction is not. I mean, nonfiction can be entertaining and fun and enjoyable and funny and all that. But a lot of the nonfiction I want to read are very serious books that are about very serious topics. And so I've avoided a lot of them for a long time. But I've slowly started reading more nonfiction in an attempt to educate myself on various topics. So with that in mind, I have four books here. I'm gonna drink some tea, then I'm gonna start with talking about one of the books that has made, like, talking about impact. This book has, it's not a long book, but it doesn't have to be because it has made a significant impact on my life. This is The Will to Change by Bell Hooks. It is uh, it is a book that it's a Bell Hooks is, to summarize her. It's hard to summarize Bell Hooks. For those not aware, Bell Hooks is a black feminist author who has written books like All About Love and obviously The Will to Change. And specifically, this book is about men, masculinity, and love. And she talks about how specifically men and how patriarchal masculinity sort of is this monster that kills the men's desires to connect emotionally, be emotionally vulnerable with people, and how men try to connect to women or other people through sex because that's the only way they understand emotional vulnerability. It's not a long book. It's about 180 pages or so. It's honestly a very short read, and I recommend everybody, and not just men, but men should definitely read this. But I think women and everybody else, like everybody, non-binary folks, everybody should read this. Everybody should read this because I think a lot of people, when they talk about men, don't really approach it for like why. Like I think I hear a lot of too. I don't want to get into a whole discussion about this because this book itself could be an entire video by itself, and maybe one day, one of these days, I have to reread this, but I will have to reread this to do a video on it. But if I could do an entire hour talking about, multiple hours probably talking about Bell Hooks and All About Love and The Will to Change. So suffice to say, it's a very good book if you're a person interested in reading feminist theory, or rather not theory. I'd say feminist literature. I think Bell Hooks is a really good place to start, and especially if you're a man, you should definitely read Bell Hooks. Not just this one, not just The Will to Change. Great, not just but I suggest starting with this one. Then you can read All About Love as well. The second book is related to the fiction books I've talked about, talking about colonization. This book. I read this book earlier this year after I read another book that I'm not going to talk about here, but after I read Babel by R.F. Kuang, which is a massively popular historical fantasy book, which deals with the topic of colonization. As anybody who has read Babel can tell you, I'm sure there are people watching this who have read Babel and know it is about colonization. And that book starts, the first chapter, I think, starts, or the prelude or the introduction of the book starts with a quote from a book. And that book is uh, The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. And this book, to provide some context, Frantz Fanon was an Algerian Marxist writer who wrote this uh, book about anti-colonialist rhetoric. No, rather rhetoric. Anti-colonialist. It's a book about anti-colonialism. It's a book about fighting colonialism and how you approach that through a Marxist lens. So he's coming through this through Marxism and combining that with anti-colonial time practices. And I think specifically the message this book is. I mean, this is another book you could do multiple videos on, like literally. There's a lot in this book. This book is in some cases hard to read, but it is a book that's I think very important for all of us to read. I think right now actually, but it is a book that will teach you about the meaning of why violence is a part of colonization and why violence is part of the solution to colonization, and that is I think an important lesson a lot of people could do with. So if you're this book is, I would say, moderately hard to read if you're not already familiar with Marxist literature. So if you're not familiar with Marxist literature, I'd suggest go read the Communist Manifesto first and then come back to this, because I think if you read this first before you read any Marxist literature predating Fanon, like Marx, like Engels, like Lenin or Mao, you're gonna find yourself confused with some of the terminology that Fanon uses in this. So I'd suggest that if you want to read this, don't be scared of it. It's not it's a heavy topic. Colonization is not a light topic, and there are parts of the book I had to skip through because it is difficult. It actually is triggering, and I'd say that if you want to read this first, go read up on basics of Marxist literature. So Communist Manifesto, read some Mao, read some Lenin, and then come to Fanon, and you will find yourself understanding it. This other part of this book, so you have to process it a little bit. You have to sit with it a bit, because I think Fanon is this. He wrote this originally in French, and the translation is. I've been told it's a little rough, and I don't read French, so I cannot tell you if that's actually the case. Or I can have an opinion on that. I don't read French, so I cannot read the original and do a comparison with the English translation by Richard Felcox. So I'm told, I mean, this is the best translation that is available, and apparently it's not that great. But that said, still extremely worth reading. So especially if you're already a leftist or some kind of socialist, please go read The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. Speaking of, I have a lot of books about colonization, surprisingly. Not surprising, but it is what it is. So the third book I want to talk about here is The 100 Years War on Palestine by Rashid Khalivi. And if there is one book that people should read about Palestine, especially right now, this book is extremely popular, as you might imagine, right now. If you want to read one, if I had to pick one book, there are many good books about Palestine. There's one actually sitting on my desk right now that I have yet to read that I'm planning on reading soon. If you're gonna read at least one book, if you're gonna say I'm gonna choose one book to read about Palestine, The 100 Years War on Palestine is the one to recommend, because not only is it thoroughly researched, Rashid Khalivi is an academic, but it's also written really well, and not in an academic sense. It's written in a very human, empathetic. When I started reading this book, I felt connected to Rashid in a real way. I felt his sort of worry, his concern, his anger, his frustration, all the emotions that Rashid was feeling throughout, like all the events that happened in this book. I could feel it. Felt like a work of. It didn't feel like an academic book. Like, it didn't feel like a book written by an actor. Or rather, let me rephrase that. It doesn't feel. There are citations at the end. There are footnotes. There are a lot of footnotes, but it is a thoroughly researched book. And Rashid Khalidi is an academic, and you cannot like say that he's not done his research and he's not done it properly. But he writes in a way that an academic doesn't, which is just a compliment for me because academics can uh, write badly, to put it in a way that I don't want to piss off anybody. But this book, I think one of the most important things about this book is not just about, obviously it's about colonization. It's about this book, that book, the Rush of the Earth, the other fiction books that talk about colonization. This book is obviously about colonization, but it's also a book about war, and specifically, like, it is a book about war. It's a book about resistance against colonization, which is one of the important through lines. This book ends with an optimistic outlook on the Palestinian question, and because I think Rashid Khalidi doesn't want to leave readers on a bad note, or more importantly, that some radical revolutionary optimism is required in times like right now, actually. This book is a book of radical revolutionary optimism in many ways, even though the topics it talks about: war, colonization, brutal suppression of an entire people, ethnic cleansing, genocide. Not a light book, but it it is much required reading for anybody who is living in our current times. And I mean, I say current times. This has been going on for more than 100 years, as the book title suggests. So it's been a good time to read this book for a long time. So I recommend everybody read that one. And the last book I'll talk about, last book of this video, last one, is a book about infrastructure. Kind of a weird. This is kind of a different one than the ones I've talked about. It's a nonfiction title. It's How Infrastructure Works by Deb Chacha, which is a book. The subhead here is Inside the System That Shape the World. It's a book about infrastructure in all kinds of ways, politically, economically, how infrastructure works, like how it actually works, how infrastructure becomes invisible, the sort of inequalities that are present in systems that we design, that are infrastructure that we design, in the ways that it takes power away from certain people and gives it to others. And it's a very important book to think about our world more. Like, if you're thinking about it, if you're a person who's interested in building, say if you're an engineer of some kind, it doesn't matter what kind of engineer I'm thinking about. And for this, like, if you want to think more systematically about the ways infrastructure affects everyday lives, everybody who uses infrastructure day to day, I think this book by Deb Chacha is well worth a read. It is an extremely well written book that it does not hold punches. It criticizes it talks about what people get wrong about understanding infrastructure, what people get frustratingly, weirdly narrow-minded about infrastructure, or how people misunderstand what infrastructure actually is, what consists of infrastructure, what infrastructure is that people don't even think about is infrastructure. So this book, highly recommend. So I've now talked about 8 different books, and all of these books have made some of an impact on me, and I hope this serves as a good introduction to me as a person, or rather me as a reader, I suppose, but also as a person. I hope this serves as like, what the kind of thoughts I have about books. Maybe it's not these. I did not do reviews in any of these books on this video because, well, we'd be here for hours. But I'm planning on doing book reviews. I have a book that I did review already for my blog on nowrouted.space, and I will go. I might make that a video because I love doing video. I want to do a video review. But that said, you can find me on on various places. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving me a few dollars over on subscribe.packetcat.ca, or if you prefer Patreon, patreon.com/Bastetrix, BASTETRIX. All these links to the subscription links, the links to the Storygraph pages for all these books will be in the description on the video. They will be in there, so you cannot tell me I didn't link them. They're gonna be in the description. You can also find me on the Fediverse Mastodon, if you're not familiar with the term Fediverse, at PacketCat at 10forward.social. You can find me on my blog, nullrotted.space. You can, of course, find me on YouTube here, YouTube at PacketCat. And if you enjoyed this video, share it with a friend, tell your friends about this channel, subscribe. You don't have to like the video, but it helps a lot. So if you want to like the video, I gotta say it. Like, I gotta say the like and subscribe thing. It's part of the ritual. You gotta do it. It's like a ritual. Like and subscribe, share it with your friends, because this is a new channel. I'm barely getting into video work, so please share it wide, share it with your friends if you enjoyed it. I will leave comments on for this video. Feel free to discuss any of these books. Be nice. Don't be rude in my comments, because I will ban you. If I see you being disrespectful, rude, or otherwise a shitty person in my comments, I will ban you. So don't be that person. Until next time, peace.